I think now when I feel a sense of disappointment because the circumstances that I'm hoping for, wanting for, praying for aren't unfolding the way I want them to. Now I realize he's telling a story that's bigger than I can even imagine. I was speaking at a church in the U.S., and after I was done speaking, this guy comes up to me, and we were in Ohio, and he said, "Hey, I go to your city all the time for business. How about the next time I'm there, let's exchange business cards, and I'll take you and your family out to dinner, and you can show me around to the ministry." And I was like, great. And we exchanged business cards, but I had a dress with no pockets, and I immediately lost his card. I remembered his name was Carlos, but that's really all I remembered. So a few months later, when he gave us a call at home, I made all these plans, and when I hung up the phone, my husband's like, "Who was that?" And I'm like, "Oh, this guy named Carlos I met. I don't remember his last name." He's like, "Oh, who does he work for?" And I'm like, "You know what? I don't remember that either." It's like, "What's he in town for?" I'm like, "I didn't even ask him." And he's like, "Well, we're not going downtown to meet someone that we know nothing about." And so we made the agreement. My husband would go down and find out who this guy was, and I would not go down and join him with all of our children until we had more information. That exact same day, completely unbeknownst to us, one of the orphanages that we serve, the director had woken up that day. His name was Edgar, and he didn't have any more money left, and they had about 50 kids in his children's home. And at that point, when he had no more food and no more money, he should have called me. It is literally the whole reason I was living there. I would have run him an emergency kit of beans and rice and eggs and oil and tortilla that would keep those children fed and full until we could have gotten them some more sustenance. But he was beginning to be afraid that the kids were putting us in a place only God belongs, that Jesus is the giver of all good gifts. We are not the giver of all good gifts. And so that afternoon, he was thinking to himself, I'm just going to ask God to bring our dinner. I don't know what it's going to look like or how it's going to look like. But when it was time for dinner, he called all the children back into the dining room. And they later would tell me they circled around the table and nothing smelled good, like nothing was cooking. And he said to them, "I don't know what we're going to eat tonight, but I know that you're some of God's most favorite kids. So we're just going to pray and ask God to bring us dinner." And the kids thought that was weird, but they were hungry, so they did. They closed their eyes, and he began to lead them in a prayer. But there was a 4-year-old boy at the table, and I don't know if you've ever been in a prayer time with a 4-year-old, but they like to interrupt. And his name is Joel, or Joel, you say in Spanish, and he raised his hand, and he was like, "Tio," which is what they called the director, meaning uncle. "Tio, we're praying that God brings us dinner." And Edgar was looking for a teachable moment, so he stopped the whole prayer and addressed this boy, and he's like, "Yes, we're praying that God brings us dinner." And the boy's like, "What kind of dinner does God bring you?" And Edgar goes, I don't honestly know what kind of dinner God's going to bring us." And the 4-year-old said, "Well, I think if he's got it, but he brings us some meat." And he's like, "Yeah, maybe." And they continued to pray, and Edgar included a prayer for some meat. And Joel was listening to that prayer, but his little mind was racing, and so he interrupts just minutes later, and he's like, Tio, what kind of meat do you think God's going to bring us?" And Edgar's like, I don't know what kind of meat God's going to bring us. And Joel's like, "Well, I do. I mean, if he's got it, but he brings us some steak." And so they continued to pray for steak. And again, we didn't even know that was going on. Meanwhile, my husband goes down to meet Carlos, and he gives me a call, and he said, "Well, your buddy Carlos works for the John Morrell Meat Company, and he's in our great big city trying to attract some new restaurant business. So he has the most incredible cuts of steak, like filet mignon and New York strip and T-bone and sirloin, and he can't take his product back over the border. They won't let him, so he's donating it to us. He's gotten a bunch of the other vendors to donate their product. I filled the back of the pickup truck. It's not going to fit in what we have at home, so we're going to just start dropping it off at the orphanages." And the first place he was going to go was Edgar's children's home. It was 8 blocks from the convention center. So I called Edgar and said, "Hey, Todd's on his way over right now with the donation. Just wanted to make sure someone's home. He wanted me to make sure you had some room in your freezer. They're bringing over this incredible cuts of steak. I know where I'm coming for dinner tomorrow night, like filet mignon and New York strip and T-bone and sirloin. And you have any room in your freezer for that?" And he pauses to tell me in that moment what they had been doing for almost an hour at the house at that point, praying. And then he pulls the phone away from his mouth and he yells to the kids, "Hey kids, God's on his way over with your steak." And I think one of the things I like about that story is, one, I don't like to get my back up against a wall. And when I do, my tendency is almost always to cry out to man. And it's not that man won't respond, but they bring you things like beans and rice and eggs and oil and tortilla, which makes you feel like you got full, but it's actually pretty cheap. And I appreciate the faith of Edgar, who allowed God to show up and show off in the ways that only God can do. But I also like that story because The Bible does teach us that it takes faith the size of a mustard seed to move a mountain, and the faith of a 4-year-old orphan is almost as small a measure as I can think of. And God decided to teach that little boy and all the rest of us that hear that story that it's never been dependent on what we bring to the table. It is always and always been wholly dependent on that which He has already accomplished. And if we cry out to Him, His response to us is the response of a father to his child. And I find myself regularly thinking about the faith of Joel and asking God sometimes, I know what I could do on my own, but I'm willing to sit back and see what it is that you want to do. And if it takes longer, and if it asks more of me, it's okay, because I like the way steak tastes.